Welcome to the read-along book club of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. If you are new here, the way this works is we read this entire book together. However, I've highlighted key points along the way, page by page, to summarize, give my commentary, etc., and hopefully continue a conversation down in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you're thinking about the novel. If you have any questions, concerns, I am not a literary scholar, but I will be giving my humble opinion here as we move through this story. And as you see on the screen, we are reading the 1818 text. So I did not know this. Funny story, the entire reason I'm doing this series is my daughter is reading this book for her English class. And I thought it would be a fun thing to read along with her. I've done it before in the past, but decided to make it a series on my YouTube channel. And we were having a conversation in the car one day. We were driving home from school, and she was mentioning something about one of the characters. And I said, no, that's not quite right. And she said, well, no, my teacher said X. And then I looked it up, and I come to find there is the 1818 is the original text, published anonymously originally. And then she revised the text in 1831, I believe it was published. And I think the story is more or less the same. I'm not going to cover all of the differences here because I don't know them all. But there are some character changes in the way the reader might perceive them, or at least the way the characters are portrayed. So if you are reading the 1831 edition, there will be some differences. I know it's a longer book, but I think the foundational elements of the story are still the same. And as you can see by this new cover, this updated cover, it of course is a Netflix film, which I'm very excited to see, which is another reason why I am rereading this. The first time I read this novel was in high school, ironically, when I was about my daughter's age. And I remember thinking it was all right. I wasn't blown away by it, but again, I wasn't an avid reader at the time. So I am going to be curious as to what I think about it now. So let us begin with Volume 1. I forgot to mention that this video is going to cover the entirety of Volume 1, which I believe is about 7 chapters plus some letters. So this entire video series is going to be 3 videos long. Buckle up, it might be a long one. I don't know how long it's going to be, but it's going to cover, I think, about 70 or so pages. We begin with letter 1, and it is a letter to Mrs. Saville of England, written from St. Petersburg in December 11th, 17 what? We're not quite sure. And you will rejoice to hear that no disaster has accompanied the commencement of an enterprise which you have regarded with such evil forebodings. I arrived here yesterday, and my first task is to assure my dear sister of my welfare and increasing confidence to the success of my undertaking. So we are introduced to a young gentleman, clearly writing letters to his sister back in England, and not boasting of his forthcoming escapades, his journeys to the Arctic. But you'll find out very shortly, if you haven't read it already, how he's excited, but he's also a little worried about what awaits him. But I walk in the streets of Petersburg. I feel a cold northern breeze play upon my cheeks, which braces my nerves and fills me with delight. Do you understand this feeling? This breeze, which has traveled from the regions towards which I am advancing, gives me a foretaste of those icy climes. I try in vain to be persuaded that the pole is the seat of frost and desolation. It ever presents itself to my imagination as the region of beauty and delight. And Margaret is her name, we find out, his dear sister. What may not be expected in a country of eternal light? Because, as we know, very, very long days up there in the north. I shall satiate my ardent curiosity with the sight of a part of the world never before visited, and may tread a land never before imprinted by the foot of man. So he's a little anxious, he's excited, he's a little overconfident, you might say. And we learn very shortly about his education and how he read a lot of books, and he was kind of vicariously living through the characters and the people that he was reading about. But this expedition has been the favorite dream of my early years. I have read with ardor the accounts of the various voyages which have been made in the prospect of arriving at the North Pacific through the seas which surround the pole. And his education, as noted here, came from Uncle Thomas's library. Learning that my father's dying injunction had forbidden my uncle to allow me to embark in a seafaring life. So he is losing himself in the texts of these voyagers. I imagine that I also might obtain a niche in the temple where the names of Homer and Shakespeare are consecrated. You are well acquainted with my failure. I inherited the fortune of my cousin, which allows him to have such a luxurious life, you might call it. 6 years have passed since I resolved on my present undertaking, and I commenced by injuring my body to hardship. I accompanied the whole whale fishers on several expeditions to the North Sea. So he is preparing himself. He's going on these other mini voyages, you might say, to prepare himself for this epic voyage. And you can see he thinks highly of himself, right? He's a little naive. He's a little ignorant in his youth. But the thing I'm wondering about most, because I've completely forgotten, is this narrative device of this novel. So this narrative device clearly begins with not Victor Frankenstein or not the creature, but of some individual who is writing letters to his sister who, as we know, discovers Victor Frankenstein on the ice. And I'm curious how this plays into the story. I thought it might come full circle back to this person, but I peeked ahead in the table of contents and I did not see any more letters. So I'm really curious to see why Mary Shelley framed this novel with this particular character. But I devoted my nights to the study of mathematics, the theory of medicine, and those branches of physical science. When my captain offered me the second dignity of the vessel and entreated me to remain with the greatest earnestness. So we can see up above here, when he learns about mathematics, the theory of medicine, and those branches of physical science, very similar to Victor Frankenstein, is it not? And there are a couple of parallels to this person and Victor, but maybe that's all we're going to get. Maybe that's all she's going to give us. We shall find out. And now, dear Margaret, do I not deserve to accomplish some great purpose? So he's looking for purpose in life. I get it, right? He's never been able to go out on some adventure. He's read of all of the amazing exploits of all of these people, and he just wants to be one of them. Will he be? We shall find out. The post road between St. Petersburg and Archangel, that is where he's going next. But I have no ambition to lose my life on the post road between St. Petersburg and Archangel. He's going to hire a ship there, and I do not intend to sail until the month of June. And when shall I return? Ah, dear sister, how can I answer this question? How indeed? Signed, your affectionate brother, R. Walton. I believe in the next letter he puts his entire name. So curious, again, these little details always pique my interest. I'm wondering what the thought process was there, which brings us to letter 2, of course. To Mrs. Seville of England, as always, Archangel. That is where he is now, the 28th March 17. What? How slowly the time passes here, encompassed as I am by frost and snow. Yet a second step is taken towards my enterprise. I have hired a vessel, and am occupied in collecting my sailors. But I have one want which I have never yet been able to satisfy. I have no friend, Margaret. When I am glowing with the enthusiasm of success, there will be none to participate my joy. He does. Well, is Victor Frankenstein a friend? I don't know. He's a guy he finds. But he's looking for companionship. He's looking for someone to share the glory, perhaps, of what he is about to discover. But I desire the company of a man who could sympathize with me, whose eyes would reply to mine. I am self-educated. For the first 14 years of my life, I ran wild on a common and read nothing but our Uncle Thomas's books of voyages. This is an interesting thing to note as well, because I don't know if you guys out there know people like this, but I know people like this who they don't really live life, but they live their lives through books, or at least their interpretation of reality is through books. Very clinical, very statistical, and that seems to be what's happening here. This kid who's read all about all this crazy stuff around the world, all these crazy voyages and adventures, thinks he's going to just magically be able to do something like this and perhaps gain some notoriety. But as you can see, hopefully you can detect anyway, he's very ignorant. Now I am 28, and I am in reality more illiterate than many schoolboys by 15. So there you go. He's a little bit humble in that regard, in that he knows that his self-education has kind of stunted his development to some degree. It is true that I have thought more, and that my daydreams are more extended and magnificent, but they want, as the painters call it, keeping. I didn't know what that was. I had to look it up. What keeping is, it's kind of an art. It's a way to have everything harmonize within the piece. So colors, composition, value. So that is what he's getting at. My lieutenant, for instance, is a man of wonderful courage and enterprise. He is madly desirous of glory. He is an Englishman, so he's in good company, or at least familiar company. The master is a person of an excellent disposition and is remarkable in the ship for his gentleness. but he will not hunt. He cannot endure the spill of blood, an interesting, ironic trait. He loved a young Russian lady. Having amassed a considerable sum in prize money, the father of the girl consented to the match, but confessing at the same time that she loved another. But he bestowed the whole on his rival, together with the remains of his prize money, to purchase stock, and then himself solicited the young woman's father to consent to her marriage with her lover. But the old man decidedly refused, thinking himself bound in honor to my friend. And he quitted his country, nor returned until he heard that his former mistress was married according to her inclinations. Hell of a guy, I think. I'm not quite sure. Now, granted, making sure this love of his has her true love, despite how her father feels. But I guess you really had no other choice, right? I mean, who wants to marry a girl who's in love with somebody else? But do not suppose that I am wavering in my resolutions. Those are as fixed as fate. The winter has been dreadfully severe, but the spring promises well. I cannot describe to you my sensations on the near prospect of my undertaking, half pleasurable and half fearful. I am going to unexplored regions, to the land of mist and snow. Continue to write me by every opportunity. Remember me with affection, should you never hear from me again. So he's almost painting himself like a tragic hero, is he not? But he's honest. He's afraid, but he's also excited. He's also opening up that he needs a friend to share his discoveries with. And this person we know now is Robert Walton, not signed R. Walton, but your affectionate brother, Robert Walton. Which brings us to letter 3. This is July 7th, 17 what? And we do not have a location, you'll note here. My dear sister, I write a few lines in haste to say that I am safe and well advanced on my voyage. I am, however, in good spirits. Floating sheets of ice that continually pass us, indicating the dangers of the region. It is the height of summer. No incidents have hitherto befallen us, 1 or 2 stiff gales, and the breaking of a mast. Adieu, my dear Margaret. Be assured that for my own sake, as well as yours, I will not rashly encounter danger. I will be cool, persevering, and prudent. Remember me to all my English friends. Most affectionately yours, R.W. So as noted, he wrote this in haste. It's a very short letter. Perhaps that's why he didn't write the location. And he just scrawled his initials. That's it. So interesting choices, narrative choices there. It feels somewhat immersive. It makes me wonder, maybe the first time he wasn't as comfortable opening up, and that's why he didn't write Robert. He put the R Winslow. And in the second letter, you notice that he is more open and honest and vulnerable, and perhaps that's why he wrote his full name. I don't know. I'm just guessing here. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. But now we are going to talk about letter 4. August 5th, 17. Also, no other location. So strange an accident has happened to us. Last Monday, July 31st, we were nearly surrounded by ice, which closed in the ship on all sides, scarcely leaving her the sea room in which she floated. About 2 o'clock, the mist cleared away, and vast and irregular plains of ice, which seemed to have no end. We perceived a low carriage, fixed on a sled and drawn by dogs, pass towards the north at the distance of half a mile. A being which had the shape of a man, but apparently of gigantic stature, sat in sledge and guided by dogs. About 2 hours after this occurrence, we heard the ground sea, and before night the ice broke. In the morning, however, as soon as it was light, I went upon deck and found all the sailors busy on one side of the vessel, apparently talking to someone in the sea. It was, in fact, a sledge, like that we had seen before. Only one dog remained alive, but there was a human being within it, whom the sailors were persuading to enter the vessel. On perceiving me, the stranger addressed me in English, although with a foreign accent. "Before I come on board your vessel," said he, "will you have the kindness to inform me whither you are bound?" I replied, however, that we were on a voyage of discovery toward the northern pole. Upon hearing this, he appeared satisfied and consented to come on board. His limbs were nearly frozen and his body dreadfully emaciated by fatigue and suffering. And then he, of course, faints. And they restored him to animation by rubbing him with brandy and forcing him to swallow a small quantity. So if you're ever frozen, just rub yourself with brandy. You guys know how it is. By slow degrees, he recovered. 2 days passed in this manner before he was able to speak. His eyes have generally an expression of wildness and even madness, but there are moments when, if anyone performs an act of kindness towards him, or does him any the most trifling service, his whole countenance is lighted up, as it were, with a beam of benevolence and sweetness that I never saw equaled. But he is generally melancholy and despairing, and sometimes he gnashes his teeth, as if impatient of the weight of woes that oppresses him. Why he had come so far upon the ice in so strange a vehicle, to seek one who fled from me. And did the man whom you pursued travel in the same fashion? Yes. Then I fancy we have seen him, for the day before we picked you up we saw some dogs drawing a sledge and with a manid across the ice. The demon, as he called him. I have doubtless excited your curiosity as well as that of these good people, but you are too considerate to make inquiries. Certainly, it would indeed be very impertinent and inhuman in me to trouble you with any inquisitiveness of mine. And yet you rescued me from a strange and perilous situation. You have benevolently restored me to life. Soon after this he inquired if I thought that the breaking up of the ice had destroyed the other sledge. I replied that I could not answer with any degree of certainty. And from this time the stranger seemed very eager to be upon the deck, to watch for the sledge which had before appeared. For my own part, I begin to love him as a brother because he's looking for a friend, and this is the man he has decided to be his friend. I said in one of my letters, my dear Margaret, that I should find no friend on the wide ocean, yet I have found a man who, before his spirit had been broken by misery, I should have been happy to have possessed as the brother of my heart. And here we have another letter, August 13th, 1701. My affection for my guest increases every day. He is so gentle, yet so wise. His mind is so cultivated, and when he speaks, although his words are culled with the choicest art, yet they flow with rapidity and unparalleled eloquence. He is now much recovered from his illness, and is continually on the deck, apparently watching for the sledge that preceded his own. He has asked me many questions concerning my design. He appeared pleased with the confidence and suggested several alterations in my plan. One day I mentioned to him the desire I always felt of finding a friend who might sympathize with me and direct me by his counsel. I said I did not belong to that class of men who are offended by advice. I am self-educated, and perhaps I hardly rely sufficiently upon my own powers. I wish, therefore, that my companion should be wiser and more experienced than myself, to confirm and support me, nor have I believed it impossible to find a true friend. I agree with you in believing that friendship is not only desirable but a possible acquisition. I once had a friend, the most noble of human creatures, and am entitled, therefore, to judge respecting friendship. You have hope and the world before you, and have no cause for despair, but I have lost everything, and cannot begin life anew. Even broken in spirit, as he is, no one can feel more deeply than he does the beauties of nature. The starry sky, the sea, and every sight afforded by these wonderful regions seems to have the power of elevating his soul from earth. Yet when he is retired into himself, he will be like a celestial spirit that has a halo around him, within whose circle no grief or folly ventures. Interesting description there. A celestial spirit that has a halo around him. And we know that religion is a very strong, or maybe we don't, maybe you guys don't. Religion is a very strong theme in this book, or at least the act of creation. So there you go. August 19th, 17, what? Yesterday the stranger said to me, "You may easily perceive, Captain Walton, that I have suffered great and unparalleled misfortunes. I had determined once that the memory of these evils should die with me, but you have won me to alter my determination. You seek for knowledge and wisdom, as I once did, and I ardently hope that the gratification of your wishes may not be a serpent to sting you, as mine has been. I do not know that the relation of my misfortunes will be useful to you, yet, if you are inclined, listen to my tale. I believe the strange incidents connected with it will afford view of nature, which may enlarge your faculties and understanding. You will hear of powers and occurrences such as you have been accustomed to believe impossible. But I do not doubt that my tale conveys in its series eternal evidence of the truth of the events of which it is composed." I expressed these feelings in my answer, that of course he is very gratified by this. "I thank you," he replied, for your sympathy, but it is useless. My fate is nearly fulfilled. Nothing can alter my destiny. Listen to my history, and you will perceive how it is irrevocably it is determined. He then told me that he would commence his narrative the next day when I should be at leisure. And so ends the series of letters, the sequence of letters. How do you guys feel about that bet? I'm curious how Mr. Winslow is going to play a part in the story, apart from being the chronicler, because that is what he is doing here. Victor Frankenstein is recounting his tale, and he is chronicling it. Is he going to play a larger part? Well, we shall see. I am by birth a Genovese, so he's Swiss, and by my family is one of the most distinguished of that republic. My ancestors had been for many years counselors and syndics, and my father had filled several public situations with honor and reputation. He passed his younger days perpetually occupied by the affairs of his country, and it was not until the decline of his life that he thought of marrying and bestowing on the state sons who might carry his virtues and his name down to posterity. One of his most intimate friends was a merchant who from a flourishing state fell, through numerous mischances, into poverty. He retreated with his daughter to the town of Lucerne, where he lives unknown and in wretchedness. That's a popular word in this book, wretched. My father loved Beaufort with the truest friendship and was deeply grieved by his retreat in these unfortunate circumstances. He resolved to seek him out and endeavor to persuade him to begin the world again through his credit and assistance. So he is wanting to help his friend out here. And how does he do it? Well, we're about to find out. Beaufort had taken effectual measures to conceal himself, and it was 10 months before my father discovered his abode. When he entered, misery and despair alone welcomed him. Beaufort had saved but a very small sum of money from the wreck of his fortunes. At the end of 3 months, he lay on a bed of sickness, incapable of any exertion. His daughter, though, attended him with the greatest tenderness, but she saw with despair that their little fund was rapidly decreasing. But Caroline Beaufort possessed a mind of uncommon mold, and her courage rose to support her in her adversity. She procured plain work. In the 10th month, her father died in her arms, leaving her an orphan and a beggar. He came like a protecting spirit to the poor girl, who committed herself to his care. 2 years after this event, Caroline became his wife. So Frankenstein's dad is an old dude, and he's marrying this very young lady. Granted, I don't think we ever know their ages here, but when my father became a husband and a parent, he relinquished many of his public employments and devoted himself to the education of his children. Well, isn't that a good father? And as I remained for several years their only child, but before I continue my narrative, I must record an incident which took place when I was 4 years of age. My father had a sister, whom he tenderly loved, and who had married early in life, an Italian gentleman. Soon after her marriage, she had accompanied her husband into her native country. About the time I mentioned, she died, and a few months afterwards he received a letter from her husband acquainting him with his intention of marrying an Italian lady and requesting my father to take charge of the infant Elizabeth, the only child of his deceased sister. It is my wish, he said, that you should consider her as your own daughter and educate her thus. My father did not hesitate and immediately went to Italy. I have often heard my mother say that she was at that time the most beautiful child she had ever seen, and showed signs even then of a gentle and affectionate disposition. These indications and a desire to bind as closely as possible to the ties of domestic law determined my mother to consider Elizabeth as my future wife. They're cousins. Elizabeth and Victor are cousins. Pretty strange, pretty weird, but, I guess that's how it was back in those days. And to my knowledge, this is the moment anyway, I should say, that I discovered that there were two versions of Frankenstein, because my daughter was saying her teacher said that they weren't cousins, that this other girl, Elizabeth, was adopted or something like that, or this guy had the kid already. So she made it a little more palatable for those kinds of audiences, which is kind of disappointing. That's kind of why I'm really glad I'm reading the original text, because it feels a little bit more unfiltered, let's say. But from this time, Elizabeth Lavenza became my playfellow, and as we grew older, my friend. Her imagination was luxuriant, yet her capability of application was great. Her person was the image of her mind. Her hazel eyes, although as lively as a bird's, possessed an attractive softness. Her figure was light and airy, and though capable of enduring great fatigue, she appeared the most fragile creature in the world. Everyone, adored Elizabeth, as well as Victor, clearly. The world was to me a secret, which I desired to discover. To her it was vacancy, which she sought to people with the imagination of her own. My brothers were considerably younger than myself, but I had a friend in one of my schoolfellows who compensated for this deficiency. Henry Clerval was the son of a merchant of Geneva. I remember when he was 9 years old, he wrote a fairy tale, which was the delight and amazement of all of his companions. His favorite study consisted in books of chivalry and romance. No youth could have passed more happily than mine. Our studies were never forced. It was by this method and not by emulation that we were urged to application. We learned Latin and English, and that we might read the writings in those languages. In this description of our domestic circle, I include Henry Clerval, for he was constantly with us. He went to school with me and generally passed the afternoon at our house. So not dissimilar to Winslow in that he was self-educated. Granted, Mr. Frankenstein, young Frankenstein, went to school, but you can see here that his education wasn't rigid. He was free to pursue knowledge, which definitely is going to lead him to certain discoveries that put him on the path to misery, you might say. I feel pleasure in dwelling on the recollections of childhood, before misfortune had tainted my mind and changed its bright visions of extensive usefulness into gloomy and narrow reflections upon self. But in drawing the picture of my early days, I must not omit to record those events which led by insensible steps to my after tale of misery. So what's cool about first-person stories is that there is a moment of reflection. There's hindsight, because all of this, of course, is being recounted to us after it's already happened. And so, wisely so, Victor Frankenstein is not omitting anything from his story. At least he's telling us that. So he's reflecting upon his childhood and how he fondly remembers it, but it's in contrast to what befalls him a little bit later in life. And so it's almost as if he's trying to figure out what led him on this path. How did he get to this miserable state? And I think we often do that when we, in the back of our minds, when we're telling someone a story, we're sometimes trying to solve the puzzle ourselves aloud. How do we get to this point? What mistakes do we made? Was there any possible way to alter the course of history? The natural philosophy is the genius that has regulated my fate. I desire, therefore, in its narration, to state those facts which led to my predilection for that science. So it's called natural philosophy here. It's basically the natural sciences. This is just an old way of saying that. In this house, I chanced to find a volume of the works of Cornelius Agrippa. A new light seemed to dawn upon my mind, and bounding with joy, I communicated my discovery to my father. But his father wasn't so keen. My father looked carelessly at the title page of my book and said, "Ah, Cornelius Agrippa, my dear Victor, do not waste your time upon this. It is sad trash." My father had taken the pains to explain to me that the principles of Agrippa had been entirely exploded, meaning improved upon, kind of rejected now because, we've made greater advances in the sciences, and that a modern system of science had been introduced. There we go. I answered my own. I expanded it slightly, I guess. But the cursory glance my father had taken of my volume by no means assured me that he was acquainted with its contents, and I continued to read with the greatest avidity. When I returned home, my first care was to procure the whole works of this author, and afterwards of Paracelsus and Albertus Magnus. I read and studied the wild fancies of these writers with delight. I disclosed my discoveries to Elizabeth, therefore, under a promise of strict secrecy, and she did not interest herself in the subject, and I was left by her to pursue my studies alone. It may appear very strange that a disciple of Albertus Magnus should arise in the 18th century, but our family was not scientifical. So he's even admitting here that the writings of these guys is a bit dated, but his family is ignorant because they are not educated. They are not educated in the sciences. And I entered with the greatest diligence into the search of the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life, but the latter obtained my most undivided attention. What glory would attend the discovery if I could banish disease from the human frame and render man invulnerable to any but a violent death. So he's already has a God complex to a degree. He wants to achieve great things, very much like Winslow. Granted, it's in a different way, but hopefully you can start seeing some parallels between these two characters. And I think it's important to consider because, remember, Winslow is recording this story. So Frankenstein is telling him the story. Winslow is recording it. Could he be embellishing it? I'm not sure if that was Mary Shelley's intention, but it's an absolute possibility. Nor were these my only visions. The raising of ghosts or devils was a promise liberally accorded by my favorite authors. The natural phenomena that take place every day before our eyes did not escape my examination. Distillation and the wonderful effects of steam. But my utmost wonder was engaged by some experiments on an air pump. The ignorance of the early philosophers on these and several other points served to decrease their credit with me. So he's even thinking he's a little smarter than these guys were. When I was about 15 years old, we had retired to our house near Bellerive, when we witnessed a most violent and terrible thunderstorm. This is when everything starts to come together. As I stood at the door, on a sudden I beheld a stream of fire issue from an old and beautiful oak. And so soon as the dazzling light vanished, the oak had disappeared, and nothing remained but a blasted stump. Lightning. The catastrophe of this tree excited my extreme astonishment, and I eagerly inquired of my father the nature and origin of thunder and lightning. He replied, "The electricity." He had constructed a small electrical machine and exhibited a few experiments. He made also a kite, like old Ben Franklin, with a wire and string which drew down that fluid from the clouds. My father expressed a wish that I should attend a course of lectures upon natural philosophy, to which I cheerfully consented. Some accident prevented my attending these lectures until the course was nearly finished, however, and I became disgusted with the science of natural philosophy. I was busily employed in learning languages, and this is the list of my accomplishments at the age of 17. So at 17, he's already cocky. He's already thinking he's smarter than Agrippa and crew. He's on a mission to cure man of all disease, and he's infatuated with lightning. Another task also devolved upon me. When I became the instructor of my brothers, Ernest was 6 years younger than myself and was my principal pupil. He had been afflicted with ill health from infancy. William, the youngest of our family, was yet an infant, though. My father directed our studies, and my mother partook of our enjoyments. Mutual affection engaged us all to comply with and obey the slightest desire of each other. Victor wants to rid the world of disease, right? He wants to have immense power in that regard, and we are seeing it right here with his younger brother. So this is building on his obsession, clearly, because he is very close with his family. Which brings us to chapter 2. When I had attained the age of 17, my parents resolved that I should become a student at the University of Ingolstadt, because it exists in his native country. Before the day resolved upon could arrive, the first misfortune of my life occurred. Elizabeth had caught the scarlet fever, but her illness was not severe. She quickly recovered. Many arguments had been urged to persuade my mother to refrain from attending upon her. The consequences of this imprudence were fatal. On the third day, my mother sickened. So, once with his brother, now with his mother, his obsession is going to grow. She died calmly. I need not describe the feelings of those whose dearest ties are rent by that most irreparable evil. The void that presents itself to the soul, and the despair that is exhibited on the countenance. It is so long before the mind can persuade itself that she, whom we saw every day, and whose very existence appeared as part of our own, can have departed forever, that the brightest of a beloved eye can have been extinguished, and the sound of a voice so familiar and dear to the ear can be hushed, never more to be heard. So first he wanted to rid mankind of disease. What does this mean? Right? He loved his mother very much. She was very dear to him, as most mothers are to their children. And so you can see right here, Mary Shelley continues to seed, bringing someone from the dead, perhaps. My journey to Ingolstadt, which had been deferred by these events, was now again determined upon. Elizabeth endeavored to renew the spirit of cheerfulness in our little society. The day of my departure at length arrived finally, and Clairville, who spent the last evening with us, he bitterly lamented that he was unable to accompany me, but his father could not be persuaded to part with him. And I, who had ever been surrounded by amiable companions, I was now alone. So he's been growing up with his siblings and his friends and just had a beautiful, happy life, despite his brother falling ill and despite his mother dying. But now he is completely by himself. And what happens when people are by themselves? They get in their own heads, right? They start obsessing over things, you might say, or might even dig too deeply. I had sufficient leisure for these and many other reflections during my journey to Ingolstadt, which was long and fatiguing. The next morning I delivered my letters of introduction and paid a visit to some of the principal professors, and among others to M. Krempe, I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, professor of natural philosophy. Remember that, science. The professor stared. "Have you," he said, "really spent your time in studying such nonsense?" "Every minute," continued M. Krempe with warmth. "Every instant that you have wasted on those books is utterly and entirely lost. You have burdened your memory with exploded systems and useless names. Good God! In what desert land have you lived, where no one was kind enough to inform you of these fancies, which you have so greedily imbibed and are 1,000 years old and as musty as they are ancient? I little expected in this enlightened and scientific age to find a disciple of Albertus Magnus and Paracelsus. My dear sir, you must begin your studies entirely anew." And then he wrote down a list of several books treating of natural philosophy. M. Krempe was a little squat man with a gruff voice and a repulsive countenance. The teacher, therefore, did not prepossess me in favor of his doctrine. So he's judging this guy on his appearance. And although I could not consent to go and hear that little conceited fellow deliver sentences out of a pulpit, I recollected what he had said of M. Waldman, whom I had never seen, as he had hitherto been out of town. But this professor was very unlike his colleague. He appeared about 50 years of age, with an aspect expressive of the greatest benevolence. A few gray hairs covered his temples, but those at the back of his head were nearly black. His person was short, but remarkably erect, and his voice the sweetest I had ever heard. He began his lecture by a recapitulation of the history of chemistry and the various improvements made by different men of learning. "The ancient teachers of this science," said he, "promised impossibilities and performed nothing. The modern masters promise very little. They know that metals cannot be transmuted and that the elixir of life is a chimera." Is it? We'll find out. "But these philosophers, whose hands seem only made to dabble in dirt and their eyes to pore over the microscope or crucible, have indeed performed miracles. They penetrate into the recesses of nature and show how she works in her hiding places. They ascend into the heavens. They have discovered how the blood circulates and the nature of the air we breathe. They have acquired new and almost unlimited powers. They can command the thunders of heaven, mimic the earthquake, and even mock the invisible world with its own shadows." I departed highly pleased with the professor and his lecture and paid him a visit the same evening. So a high contrast between Krempe and this guy. He is much more, that is Victor Frankenstein, is much more drawn to this individual. The funny thing is, I don't think we've actually heard Victor Frankenstein's name yet in the entirety of this story, which is kind of interesting. He heard with attention my little narration concerning my studies and smiled at the names of Cornelius Agrippa and Paracelsus, but without the contempt that M. Krempe had exhibited. He said that these were men to whose indefatigable zeal modern philosophers were indebted for most of the foundations of their knowledge. They had left to us, as an easier task, to give new names and arrange in connected classifications the facts which they in a great degree had been the instruments of bringing to light. The labors of men of genius, however erroneously directed, scarcely ever fail in ultimately turning to the solid advantage of mankind. I listened to this statement and then added that his lecture had removed my prejudices against modern chemists. So we know that Frankenstein was so obsessed with these older scientists, and now he's had a bit of a breakthrough or been convinced, influenced by this gentleman, by not only his appearance, but his delivery. "I am happy," said M. Waldman, "to have gained a disciple, and if your application equals your ability, I have no doubt of your success. Chemistry is that branch of natural philosophy in which the greatest improvements have been and may be made. It is on that account that I have made it my peculiar study. But at the same time, I have not neglected the other branches of science. I should advise you to apply every branch of natural philosophy, including mathematics." Sounding very similar to Winslow, is he not? Is it true? Is it not? Is Winslow putting himself in the story by proxy? Am I overthinking this? Probably. He then took me into his laboratory and explained to me the uses of his various machines. He also gave me the list of books which I had requested, and I took my leave. And thus ended a day memorable to me. It decided my future destiny. I really like the way she's depicting Victor Frankenstein here because it's so realistic, right? He's 17 years old. He's very impressionable. He thought he knew things, and then he met someone who kind of laughed in his face about this, who had the same opinion as his father, right? There might be a little bit of a connection there. And then he discovered this man, Waldman, who is a mentor of sorts. He's inspiring young Frankenstein. And it's so realistic because in school I've had plenty of teachers who've inspired me, who've got me to think about certain things in a different way. One thing I'll never forget is my first year in college, I had to take political science, and I had no interest in it whatsoever. But our professor was so interesting, so charismatic that it really captured my attention. And I think that is really the mark of a great teacher, to be able to make a subject that you absolutely detest into something exciting. So if you have a teacher like that out there, or a professor, I'd love to hear a story down in the comments, because I think we all have a story like that, don't we? Not that I ever became a political scientist, but anyway, he made it far less painful and, dare I say, fun. But let us move on to chapter 3. From this day, natural philosophy, and particularly chemistry, in the most comprehensive sense of the term, became nearly my sole occupation. I found even in M. Kremp a great deal of sound sense and real information. Okay, so he's starting to open up. He's starting to not be so closed off and ignorant, and listening to all parties around him. In M. Waldman, I found a true friend. A true friend, right? Highlighted because Winslow is looking for a true friend. He found a true friend. In Frankenstein, more parallels. It was perhaps the amiable character of this man that inclined me more to that branch of natural philosophy which he professed than an intrinsic love for the science itself. So he's even admitting here completely that this guy is more interesting to him than the science itself, or at least he had a larger influence. That application, which at first had been a matter of duty and resolution, now became so ardent and eager that the stars often disappeared in the light of morning whilst I was yet engaged in my laboratory. It may be easily conceived that I improved rapidly. Of course he did. And that's, I think, one of the flaws in this novel, and we'll get to it when we get there, but I feel like he improved a little bit too ridiculously rapidly and didn't make as many mistakes as I think one would, especially when you are ignorant, naive, think you have the world at your fingertips, so to speak. But 2 years pass in this manner, which brings them to, I guess, 19, right? In other studies, you go as far as others have gone before you, and there is nothing more to know. But in a scientific pursuit, there is continual food for discovery and wonder. I kind of disagree with that. I think in the arts, you can go further than your contemporaries or the masters of the time. There's always constantly, new discoveries being made in literature, in art, in music. So sorry, Mary Shelley, or Victor Frankenstein, I should say. I disagree with that line. But the end of 2 years, I made some discoveries in the improvement of some chemical instruments, which procured me great esteem and admiration at the university. When I had arrived at this point and had become as well acquainted with the theory and practice of natural philosophy as depended on the lessons of any of the professors at Ingolstadt, my residence there being no longer conducive to my improvements. Okay, now he thinks he's better than the university. Let's see where he goes next. One of the phenomena which had peculiarly attracted my attention was the structure of the human frame, and indeed any animal endued with life, whence I often asked myself, did the principle of life proceed? And determined thenceforth to apply myself more particularly to those branches of natural philosophy which relegate to physiology. Thus it begins. I became acquainted with the science of anatomy, but this was not sufficient. I must also observe the natural decay and corruption of the human body. In my education, my father had taken the greatest precautions that my mind should be impressed with no supernatural horrors. I do not even remember to have trembled at a tale of superstition, or to have feared the apparition of a spirit. Darkness had no effect upon my fancy. Which is interesting, we come to find, because his reaction is exactly what he says he is impervious to. And a churchyard was to me the receptacle of bodies deprived of life, which, from being the seat of beauty and strength, had become food for the worm, forced to spend days and nights in vaults and charnel houses. I saw how the fine form of man was degraded and wasted. I beheld the corruption of death succeed to the blooming cheek of life. I saw how the worm inherited the wonders of the eye and brain. I paused, examining and analyzing all of the minutiae of causation, as exemplified in the change from life to death and death to life, until from the midst of this darkness a sudden light broke in upon me. That is a beautiful passage. I love this entire section of him going through the graveyards, finding all these bodies, figuring out what life and death is, or at least what he thinks it is, and trying to deconstruct it so he can create it, reverse it. Well, I think you know the answer to that. Remember, I am not recording the vision of a madman, he reminds us right here, right? So he's telling us, I'm not crazy. This really happened. I'm totally of sound mind. If you guys aren't familiar with the term the unreliable narrator, I think this is a great little indication. After days and nights of incredible labor and fatigue, I succeeded in discovering the cause of generation and life. Nay, more. I became myself capable of bestowing animation upon lifeless matter. Cha-ching, he's done it. What had been the study and desire of the wisest men since the creation of the world was now within my grasp. So already, God complex. It makes sense. He's a young guy. He's a cocky guy. He's had some mentors. He's had some mentors. He's even decided that he can't learn anything new from the university. So he is very high on himself, is he not? I see by your eagerness. And this is interesting because he is addressing Winslow at this moment, right? It's kind of a breaking of the fourth wall in a way. I love this part. It happens a few times. I see by your eagerness and the wonder and hope which your eyes express, my friend, that you expect to be informed of the secret with which I am acquainted. Learn from me, if not by my precepts, at least by my example, how dangerous is the acquirement of knowledge, and how much happier than man is who believes his native town to be the world, than he who aspires to become greater than his nature will allow. So he's telling Winslow right now, chill out, man. What you're doing is not good for you, right? Stay in your hometown, live a simple, peaceful life, because you striving for greatness is going to only cause you pain. I doubted at first whether I should attempt the creation of a being like myself, or one of simpler organization, but my imagination was too much exalted by my first success to permit me to doubt of my ability to give life to an animal as complex and wondrous as a man. It was with these feelings that I began the creation of a human being. As the minuteness of these parts formed a great hindrance to my speed, I resolved, contrary to my first intention, to make the being of a gigantic stature, that is to say, about 8 feet in height, and proportionally large. So not only is he deciding to go straight to making a human versus like a mouse or an insect or something like that, he wants a big boy. He has his eyes on the big prize. He doesn't want to go slowly. He wants to go straight to the big leagues. A new species would bless me. As its creator and source, many happy and excellent natures would owe their being to me. So that, if that isn't God complex right there, I don't know what is. But remember, he's told us he's not a madman. Who shall conceive the horrors of my secret toil as I dabbled among the unhallowed damps of the grave, or tortured the living animal to animate the lifeless clay? In a solitary chamber, or rather cell, at the top of the house, I kept my workshop of filthy creation. The summer months passed while I was thus engaged, heart and soul in one pursuit. It was a most beautiful season, vintage, but my eyes were insensible to the charms of nature, and the same feelings which made me neglect the scenes around me caused me also to forget those friends who were so many miles absent, and whom I had not seen for so long a time. I knew my silence disquieted them, and I well remembered the words of my father. I know that while you are pleased with yourself, you will think of us with affection, and we shall hear regularly from you. You must pardon me if I regard any interruption with your correspondence as a proof that your other duties are equally neglected. So even Daddy wants to hear from him. If the study to which you apply yourself has a tendency to weaken your affections and to destroy your taste for those simple pleasures in which no alloy can possibly mix, then that study is certainly unlawful. That is to say, not befitting a human mind. So Frankenstein, it's another cautionary tale he's telling Winslow right here. You know, if you can't balance your obsession, your interest with everything else, it's going to destroy you. It's not befitting the human mind. but I forget that I am moralizing in the most interesting part of my tale. And your looks remind me to proceed. Again, he's addressing Winslow here. My father made no reproach in his letters, and only took notice of my silence by inquiring into my occupations more particularly than before. And every night I was oppressed by a slow fever, and I became nervous to a most painful degree, a disease that I had regretted the more because I had hitherto enjoyed most excellent health, and had always boasted of the firmness of my nerves. But I believed that exercise and amusement would soon drive away such symptoms, and I promised myself both of these when my creation should be complete. So he's telling himself, I'm getting so consumed by my work, it's getting me sick, but once I complete what I'm setting out to do, I'll get some fresh air, basically. And that brings us to chapter 4. It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld my accomplishment of my toils. It was already 1 in the morning. The rain pattered dismally against the panes. I love that atmosphere. And my candle was nearly burnt out, when, by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs. Interesting here, because in all of the depictions of Frankenstein that I've seen anyway, it's an epic event that this monster is created. But right here, he's just saying it's quiet, the rain is pattering on the roof, the candles are crackling, and that's it. And then I see this dull yellow eye open. It's interesting because this is a very pivotal moment. This is a crucial moment in the story. One that I totally forgot happened this early on. For whatever reason, I thought that the creature was created later in the story. But I kind of like this in a way. It goes counter to what we expect in storytelling, in that pivotal events should have a primary focus on them, whereas this one kind of just happens quietly. Albeit very atmospherically, it still happens quietly. And here we get a description of the creature. His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful! Of course, because he's a god. Great God! His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness, but these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost of the same color as the dun-white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips. So he's beautiful, but also hideous. This is also interesting because, every depiction I've seen, again, of the monster is, he's got seams all over his body, he's stitched up, he's kind of grotesque, and I'm curious here if this is a true observation or if this is a clouded observation by Frankenstein because he is so proud at what he's done. Because remember, this is through his perspective. But also, he does admit that while there is beauty, like the pearly white teeth and the luxurious hair, he does look creepy in other ways, like with the black lips and his eyes. I had worked hard for nearly 2 years for the sole purpose of infusing life into an inanimate body. I desired it with an ardor that far exceeded moderation. But now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. I rushed out of the room and continued a long time traversing my bedchamber, unable to compose my mind to sleep. So finally he achieves what he wants, and he hates it. It disgusts him. He flees the scene. He tries to go to sleep. He gets crazy, wild dreams, thinking of Elizabeth in the bloom of health, walking in the streets of Ingolstadt. Delighted and surprised, I embraced her. But as I imprinted the first kiss on her lips, they're cousins, remember? They became livid with the hue of death. Her features appeared to change, and I thought that I held the corpse of my dead mother in my arms. A shroud enveloped her form, and I saw the grave worms crawling in the folds of the flannel. So he is utterly tortured. He is wretched, as he likes to call himself. But remember, he stated that nothing supernatural could scare him. Granted, is this supernatural? I don't know. I'll let you be the judge. By the dim and yellow light of the moon, as it forced its way through the window shutters, I beheld the wretch, the miserable monster whom I had created. And he rushes down the stairs. I took refuge in the courtyard belonging to the house which I inhabited. Oh, no mortal could support the horror of that countenance. Countenance is a word that is used quite a bit in the story as well. Unfinished, he was ugly then, But when those muscles and joints were rendered capable of motion, it became a thing, such as even Dante could not have conceived. Finally, morning, dismal and wet, at length dawned. I did not dare return to the apartment which I inhabited, but felt impelled to hurry on. Although wetted by the rain, which poured from a black and comfortless sky, my heart palpitated in the sickness of fear, and I hurried on with irregular steps, not daring to look about me. And here we're treated to a little poem, like one who, on a lonely road, doth walk in fear and dread, and having once turned around, walks on, and turns no more his lead, because he knows a frightful fiend doth close behind him tread. Which is kind of what's going to happen, right? He thinks it's going to happen. This monster he's created is coming close behind him. It's lurking. It's following him. However, we find out a little bit differently later on, don't we? But a coach that was coming towards me from the other end of the street, I perceived Henry Clerval, his buddy, who on seeing me instantly sprung out. "My dear Frankenstein," exclaimed he, "how glad I am to see you! How fortunate that you should be here at the very moment of my alighting!" But I felt suddenly, and for the first time during my many months, calm and serene joy. We walked toward my college. "You may easily believe," said he, "how great was the difficulty to persuade my father that it was not absolutely necessary for a merchant not to understand anything except bookkeeping. But his affection for me at length overcame his dislike of learning, and he has permitted me to undertake a voyage of discovery to the land of knowledge." So finally, Clerval is set free by his father. "It gives me the greatest delight to see you, but tell me how you left my father, brothers, and Elizabeth." "Very well and very happy, only a little uneasy that they hear from you so seldom. I did not before remark how very ill you appear, so thin and pale. You look as if you had been watching for several nights." I then reflected, and the thought made me shiver, that the creature whom I had left in my apartment might still be there, alive, and walking about. Then I threw the door forcefully open, but nothing appeared. I stepped fearfully in. The apartment was empty, and my bedroom was also freed from its hideous guest. I clapped my hands for joy and ran down to Clerval. We ascended into my room, and the servant presently brought breakfast. So he's excited. He has rid himself of this monster. "My dear Victor," cried he, "what for God's sake is the matter?" "Do not ask me," cried I, putting my hands before my eyes, for I thought I saw the dreaded spectre glide into the room. "He can tell. Oh, save me, save me." This was the commencement of a nervous fever, which confined me for several months. During all that time, Henry was my only nurse. He just basically, physically, is destroyed. He falls into an illness. Everything is catching up to him. All of these sleepless nights, all of these many years of work have manifested as ill health. By very slow degrees and with frequent relapses that alarmed and grieved my friend, I recovered. So he gets better. "Dearest Clerval," I exclaimed I, "how kind, how very good of you to me. This whole winter, instead of being spent in study, as you promised yourself, has been consumed by my sick room. How shall I ever repay you? You will repay me entirely if you do not discompose yourself, but get well as fast as you can, and since you appear in such good spirits, I may speak to you on one subject, may I not?" I trembled. One subject? What could it be? "Compose yourself," said Clerval, who observed my change of color. "I will not mention it if it agitates you, but your father and cousin would be very happy if they received a letter from you in your own handwriting. They hardly know how ill you have been, and are uneasy at your long silence." And of course, Victor is very relieved at this. "You will perhaps be glad to see a letter that has been lying here some days for you. It is from your cousin, I believe, Elizabeth." Which brings us to chapter 5. And this is a letter from Elizabeth. Clerval then put the following letter into my hands. "To V. Frankenstein. My dear cousin, I cannot describe to you the uneasiness we have all felt concerning your health, for it is now several months since we have seen your handwriting, and all this time you have been obliged to dictate your letters to Henry. Surely, Victor, you must have been exceedingly ill. Clerval always writes that you are getting better. I eagerly hope that you will confirm this intelligence soon in your own handwriting. Your father's health is now vigorous, that he appears 10 years younger. Ernest also is so much improved that you would hardly know him. He is now nearly 16. My uncle and I conversed a long time last night about what profession Ernest should follow, and I therefore proposed that he should be a farmer. A farmer is a very healthy, happy life, and the least hurtful, or rather the most beneficial profession of any." So she's almost saying, like, don't go the education route. Live the simple life, very much like Victor Frankenstein is telling Mr. Winslow. And now I must tell you a little story that will please and perhaps amuse you. Do you not remember Justine Moritz? Madame Moritz, her mother, was a widow with 4 children, of whom Justine was the third. This girl had always been the favorite of her father, but through a strange perversity, her mother could not endure her, and after the death of M. Moritz, treated her very ill. My aunt observed this, and when Justine was 12 years of age, prevailed on her mother to allow her to live at her house. Justine, thus received in our family, learned the duties of a servant, a condition which, in our fortunate country, does not include the idea of ignorance and a sacrifice of the dignity of the human being. And Justine was a great favorite of yours. My aunt conceived a great attachment for her, by which she was induced to give her an education superior to that which she had first intended. And when my dearest aunt died, every one was too much occupied in their own grief to notice poor Justine, who had attended her during her illness with the most anxious affection. Poor Justine was very ill, but other trials were reserved for her. One by one, her brothers and sister died, and her mother, with the exception of her neglected daughter, was left childless. She began to think that these deaths of her favorites was a judgment from heaven to chastise her partiality. A few months after your departure for Ingolstadt, Justine was called home by her repentant mother. She sometimes begged Justine to forgive her unkindness, but much oftener accused her of having caused the death of her brothers and sister. She died on the first approach of cold weather, at the beginning of this last winter. Justine has now returned to us. I must also say a few words to you, my dear cousin, of little darling William. I wish you could see him. He is very tall of his age, with sweet laughing blue eyes, dark eyelashes, and curling hair. Now, dear Victor, I dare say you wish to be indulged in a little gossip concerning the good people of Geneva. The pretty Miss Mansfield has already received the congratulatory visits of her approaching marriage with a young Englishman. I have written myself into good spirits, dear cousin, yet I cannot conclude without again anxiously inquiring concerning your health. Dear Victor, if you are not very ill, write yourself, and make your father and all of us happier. Elizabeth Lavenza, Geneva, March 18th. Interesting little way to describe, what's going on. I think normally in novels, granted this is a very old novel, 1818, but normally now in novels, this kind of stuff is summarized versus being in letter form, word for word. But it does make it feel a little bit more genuine, though, doesn't it, having the entire text in here? It's not particularly exciting, but it is realistic in that it's as if you're seeing everything that Victor Frankenstein saw. Dear, dear Elizabeth, I exclaimed when I had read the letter, I will write instantly and relieve them from their anxiety they must feel. One of my first duties on my recovery was to introduce Clairville to the several professors of the university. Ever since that fatal night, the end of my labors, I had conceived a violent antipathy, even to the name of natural philosophy. The sight of a chemical instrument would renew all the agony of my nervous symptoms. Henry saw this and had removed all my apparatus from my view. M. Walden inflicted torture when he praised with kindness and warmth the astonishing progress I had made in the sciences. He soon perceived that I disliked the subject. So everything Frankenstein has been working toward is destroyed. He's disgusted by it. He's turned away from it. And his friend and his a man he respected highly, this Professor Waldman, is there to remind him, to congratulate him of the horrors, right, that he has unearthed. But M. Kremp was not equally docile. "Damn the fellow!" cried he. "Why, Mem Clerval, I assure you he has outstripped us all. Aye, stare if you please, but it is nevertheless true. A youngster who but a few years ago believed Cornelius Agrippa as firmly as the gospel has now set himself at the head of the university." For my own part, idleness had never been irksome to me. I felt great relief in being the fellow pupil with my friend, and found not only instruction, but consolation in the works of the Orientalists. Their melancholy is soothing, their joy elevating to a degree I never experienced. When you read their writings, life appears to consist in a warm sun and a garden of roses, in the smiles and frowns of a fair enemy, and the fire that consumes your own heart. So he is coping with this other subject. The month of May had already commenced, and I expected the letter daily, which was to fix the date of my departure, when Henry proposed a pedestrian tour in the environs of Ingolstadt, that I might bid a personal farewell to the country I had long inhabited. We passed a fortnight in these perambulations, and my health and spirits had long been restored. Clairville called forth the better feelings of my heart. He again taught me to love the aspect of nature and the cheerful faces of children. Excellent friend! I became the same happy creature who a few years ago, loving and beloved by all, had no sorrow or care. And we returned to our college on a Sunday afternoon. The peasants were dancing, and every one we met appeared gay and happy. My own spirits were high, and I bounded along with feelings of unbridled joy and hilarity. We'll find out in the course of this novel, Frankenstein is going to have a lot of ups and downs. And he's going to find different ways of coping with this thing, but the horror that he has discovered, that he has created, is going to continually haunt him and drive him to madness, although we do know that he said he's not a madman, right? Which brings us to chapter 6, and this is a letter from his father. To V. Frankenstein. My dear Victor, you have probably waited impatiently for a letter to fix the date of your return to us, and I was at first tempted to write only a few lines, merely mentioning the day on which I should expect you. But that would be a cruel kindness, and I dare not do it. And how, Victor, can I relate our misfortune? William is dead, that sweet child whose smiles delighted and warmed my heart, who was so gentle, yet so gay. Victor, he is murdered. I love that Shelley is stacking on a terrible event after a terrible event. And we just ended this previous chapter, on a high note, and now this is going to bring Victor all the way back down. Last Thursday, May 7th, we discovered that William and Ernest, who had gone on before, were not to be found. William had run away to hide himself, and that he vainly sought for him, and afterwards waited for him a long time, that he did not return. About 5 in the morning, I discovered my lovely boy, whom the night before I had seen blooming and active in health, stretched on the grass, livid and motionless. The print of the murderer's finger was on his neck. Come, dearest Victor, you alone can console Elizabeth. We are all unhappy, but will not that be an additional motive for you, my son, to return and be our comforter? Alphonse Frankenstein, Geneva, May 12th, 17-something. I threw the letter on the table and covered my face with my hands. My dear Frankenstein, exclaimed Henry. Are you always to be unhappy, my dear friend? What has happened? Tears also gushed from the eyes of Clairville. I can offer you no consolation, my friend, said he. Your disaster is irreparable. What do you intend to do? To go instantly to Geneva. Come with me, Henry, to order the horses. My journey was very melancholy. At first I wished to hurry on, but when I drew near my native town, I slackened my progress. I could hardly sustain the multitude of feelings that crowded into my mind. I passed through scenes familiar to my youth, but which I had not seen for nearly 6 years. My country, my beloved country, who but a native can tell the delight I took in again beholding thy streams, thy mountains, and, more than all, thy lovely lake. It was completely dark when I arrived in the environs of Geneva. As I was unable to rest, I resolved to visit the spot where my poor William had been murdered. The storm, as is often the case in Switzerland, appeared at once in various parts of the heavens. Interesting, right? Because we remember he first saw lightning that sort of ignited, so to speak, his fascination with electricity and what led him to create the creature. While I watched the storm, so beautiful and yet terrific, I wandered on with a hasty step. And then I perceived in the gloom a figure, which stole from behind a clump of trees near me. I stood fixed, gazing intently. I could not be mistaken. A flash of lightning illuminated the object and discovered its shape plainly to me. Its gigantic stature and the deformity of its aspect, more hideous than belongs to humanity, instantly informed me that it was the wretch, the filthy demon to whom I have given life. Could it be the murder of my brother? Had the murderer returned to the scene, as they often do? He was the murderer, Victor decides. I could not doubt it. Alas, I had turned loose into the world a depraved wretch whose delight was in carnage and misery. Day dawned, and I directed my steps towards the town. The gates were open, and I hastened to my father's house. But I paused when I reflected on the story that I had to tell. A being whom I myself had formed and endued with life had met me at midnight among the precipices of an inaccessible mountain. These reflections determined me, and I resolved to remain silent, because who's going to believe him, right? He's not a madman. They will think he's a madman. It was about 5 in the morning when I entered my father's house, and went into the library to attend their usual hour of rising. While I was thus engaged, Ernest entered. "Welcome, my dearest Victor," said he. "I wish you had come 3 months ago, and then you would have found us all joyous and delighted, but we are now unhappy, and I am afraid tears instead of smiles will be your welcome. And tell me, how does my father support his misfortunes, and how is my poor Elizabeth?" "She indeed requires consolation. She accused herself of having caused the death of my brother, and that made her very wretched. But since the murder has been discovered—" "The murder has been discovered? The murder has been discovered! Good God, how can that be? Who would credit that Justine Moritz, who was so amiable and fond of the family, could all at once become so extremely wicked? Justine Moritz, poor girl, is she the accused? But it is wrongfully. Everyone knows that. No one believes it. Surely, Ernest." "No one did at first, but several circumstances came out that have almost forced conviction upon us, and her own behavior has been so confused as to add to the evidence of facts a weight that, I fear, leaves no hope for doubt." He related that the morning on which the murder of poor William had been discovered, Justine had taken ill and confined to her bed. He discovered in her pocket the picture of my mother, which had been judged to be the temptation of the murderer. "You are all mistaken. I know the murder. Justine, poor kid Justine, is innocent. My dear father, you are mistaken. Justine is innocent. If she is, God forbid that she should suffer as guilty. She is to be tried today, and I sincerely hope, that she will be acquitted." We were soon joined by Elizabeth. Time had made great alterations in her form since I had last beheld her. She was now a woman in stature and expression of countenance, which was uncommonly lovely. "You arrived, my dear cousin," said she. "Fills me with hope. You perhaps will find some means to justify my poor guiltless Justine. Alas, who is safe if she be convicted of a crime? I rely on her innocence as certainly as I do upon my own." "She is innocent, my Elizabeth," said I, "and that shall be proved." "How kind you are! Everyone else believes her guilt, and that made me wretched." "Sweet niece," said my father, "dry your tears. If she is, as you believe, innocent, rely on the justice of our judges and the activity with which I shall prevent the slightest shadow of partiality." Which brings us to the final chapter of Volume 1, Chapter 7. We passed a few sad hours until 11 o'clock, when the trial was to commence. I suffered living torture. It was to be decided whether the result of my curiosity and lawless devices would cause the death of 2 of my fellow beings. The appearance of Justine was calm. She was dressed in mourning, yet she appeared confident in innocence and did not tremble. The trial began, and after the advocate against her had stated the charge, several witnesses were called. She had been out the whole night on which the murder had been committed, and towards the morning had been perceived by a market woman not far from the spot where the body of the murdered child had been afterwards found. She had been looking for the child. When shown the body, she fell into violent hysterics. The picture was then produced, which the servant had found in her pocket, and when Elizabeth, in a faltering voice, proved that it was the same which, an hour before the child had been missed, she had placed round his neck, a murmur of horror and indignation filled the court. Justine was called on for her defense. "God knows," she said, "how entirely I am innocent, but I do not pretend that my protestation should acquit me. I rest my innocence on the plain and simple explanation of the facts which have been adduced against me." She then related that, by the permission of Elizabeth, she had passed the evening of the night on which the murder had been committed at the house of an aunt. She met a man who asked her if she had seen anything from the child who was lost, and when the gates of Geneva were shut, she was forced to remain several hours of the night in a barn belonging to a cottage. But concerning the picture, she gave no account. "I am only left to conjecture concerning the probabilities by which it might have been placed in my pocket." Several witnesses were called who had known her for many years, and they spoke well of her, but fear and hatred of the crime of which they supposed her guilty rendered them timorous and unwilling to come forward. Elizabeth saw even this last resource. "I am," said she, "the cousin of the unhappy child who was murdered, or rather his sister. I wish to be allowed to speak, that I may say what I know of her character. She nursed Madame Frankenstein, my aunt, in her last illness with the greatest affection and care, and afterwards attended her own mother during a tedious illness. Excellent, Elizabeth, a murmur of approbation was heard, and I rushed out of the court in agony. The fangs of remorse tore at my bosom. The ballots had been thrown, they were all black, and Justine was condemned. When I returned home, Elizabeth eagerly demanded the result. My cousin, replied I, it is decided as you may have expected. All the judges had rather than 10 innocents should suffer, than the one guilty should escape, but she has confessed. Alas, said she, how shall I ever again believe in human benevolence? Soon after we heard that the poor victim had expressed a wish to see my cousin. Yes, said Elizabeth, I will go, although she is guilty, and you, Victor, shall accompany me. I cannot go alone. We entered the gloomy prison chamber, and beheld Justine sitting on some straw at the further end. Her hands were manacled, and her head rested on her knees. Oh, Justine, said she, why did you rob me of my last consolation? And do you also believe that I am so very, very wicked? Rise, my poor girl, said Elizabeth. Why do you kneel if you are innocent? That report, you say, is false, and be assured, dear Justine, that nothing can shake my confidence in you for a moment, but your own confession. I did confess, but I confessed a lie. I confessed that I might obtain absolution. Ever since I was condemned, my confessor has besieged me. He threatened and menaced, until I almost began to think that I was the monster that he said I was. Oh, Justine, a lot of melodrama. Well, I mean, is it melodrama? It sounds like it. Granted, she's in prison and she's innocent. Well, we think she's innocent anyway, so I guess melodrama is a bad word, but sometimes this dialogue cracks me up. Forgive me for having for one moment distrusted you. Yet you must die, you, my playfellow, my companion, my more than sister. And dear, sweet Elizabeth, do not weep. You ought to raise me with the thoughts of a better life, and elevate me from the petty cares of this world of injustice and strife. I will try to comfort you, but this, I fear, is an evil too deep and poignant to admit of consolation, for there is no hope. Yet heaven bless thee, my dearest Justine, with resignation and a confidence elevated beyond this world. During this conversation, I had retired to a corner of the prison room where I could conceal the horrid anguish that possessed me. Justine started. When she saw who it was, she approached me and said, Dear sir, you are very kind to visit me. You, I hope, did not believe that I am guilty. I could not answer. No, Justine, said Elizabeth. He is more convinced of your innocence than I was. I truly thank him. In these last moments I feel the sincerest gratitude towards those who think of me with kindness. How sweet is the affection of others to such a wretch as I am. It was with great difficulty that Elizabeth could tear herself away. I wish, cried she, that I were to die with you. I cannot live in this world of misery. Justine assumed an air of cheerfulness, though. Farewell, sweet lady, dearest Elizabeth, my beloved and only friend. May heaven in its bounty bless and preserve you. May this be the last misfortune that you will ever suffer. Live and be happy, and make others so. Those words are just twisting the knife into Victor's gut and his heart. And as we returned, Elizabeth said, You know not, my dear Victor, how much I am relieved now that I trust in the innocence of this unfortunate girl. Amiable cousin, such were your thoughts, mild and gentle as your own dear eyes and voice, but I was a wretch, and none ever conceived of the misery that I then endured. The end of Volume 1. So that brings us to the end of Volume 1, as stated right here. What are you guys thinking so far? This is a much longer video than I anticipated, but I guess we covered a lot of pages. We have a lot of great character development going on here. We have, first and foremost, our Winslow, who is trying to achieve great things. He is young, he is cocky. He meets Victor Frankenstein, who has already achieved great things, who is young, who is cocky, who is a cautionary tale for Winslow. He is warning him against seeking such greatness, right? He's like, stay home. Just live in a small town, have a small, simple life. It's going to be better for you. But Victor gets obsessed. He creates a monster. He thinks he's better and smarter than everybody else. And of course, he's horrified when he does so. But even worse than that, his brother is killed. He thinks he's killed by this monster. And this poor, poor girl, Justine, is blamed for the murder. A lot of pain has happened in these, 70 some odd pages. But I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. Is there anything that I did not discuss that you thought I should have? If so, we can continue the conversation down in the comments. And thanks for watching. Thanks for hanging out with me. And I will see you in the next video with Volume 2 of Frankenstein.